The lamp smoke hangs low in the room, and the paper under your fingers feels dry as old leaves. Outside, rain taps the window in a soft, patient rhythm. Inside, a scholar bends over a page and pauses, because three ancient languages laid side by side in the candlelight are beginning to look less like strangers and more like family. That is where tonight's mystery begins. It begins with a suspicion, quiet, almost polite, that some of the most important languages in human history might descend from a source no one has ever seen written down. A mother tongue with no surviving manuscript, no carved stone, no ink on parchment. And yet, its shadow lies over an enormous part of the world. In 1786, Sir William Jones said something that changed the study of language forever. Jones was not speaking loosely, and he was not chasing poetry. He noticed that Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin were too deeply connected to be explained by chance. Not just similar here and there, not just borrowing a few convenient words, but sprung, as he saw it, from one common source. That moment, simple as it sounds now, was the seed of comparative linguistics. And once you hear the first echo, you cannot unhear it. Take a word as intimate as mother. In English, mother. In Latin, mater. In Sanskrit, matar. In Greek, meter. Those are not random lookalikes. They point backward, towards something linguists later wrote with an asterisk, a reconstructed root, asterisk, MEH2TER, a form no one recorded at the time because it was never written down. It had to be rebuilt piece by piece from its descendants, like a face inferred from generations of children. That is the strange beauty of Proto-Indo-European, the reconstructed mother tongue. It is absent and yet everywhere, silent and yet still speaking through words you already know. And in the next step, the question becomes much sharper. How do scholars prove that this lost voice was real and not just a beautiful illusion? If this kind of deep history mystery is your thing, A Quiet Like helps me keep making them. And that is where the mystery sharpens. Because a resemblance is not enough. Anyone can place two words side by side and feel a little spark of similarity. Sometimes that spark is real. Sometimes it is only coincidence, the kind of pattern the human mind loves to invent when it is tired, hopeful, or simply enchanted by a good story. If this vanished mother tongue was going to be taken seriously, Sir William Jones's insight from 1786 had to become something stronger than intuition. So let's pause and gather the clue we already have. Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin seemed elegant together. They seemed related in a deep, structural way. And once scholars began to look closely, the family word we touched a moment ago, mother, matter, matar, meter, stopped feeling like an isolated curiosity. It became a test case. This is where the work turns patient, almost tactile. Imagine a desk covered in notes, the scrape of a pen, candle wax cooling at the edge of the holder. A linguist does not ask, do these words sound vaguely alike? The question is narrower, stricter, and far more powerful. Do the changes repeat? Does one sound in one language regularly match another sound in another language, across many words, not just one? If it does, then you are not looking at a lucky accident. You may be looking at inheritance. That is the heart of the comparative method. It works by tracing regular sound correspondences across daughter languages, not only in famous words, not only in words people love to quote, but in pattern after pattern after pattern. And from those patterns, scholars move backward toward a reconstructed root, a careful model of something older, hidden behind the forms we still speak. That is why the asterisk matters, by the way. When linguists write asterisk me tu ter, they are signaling something very honest. This form is reconstructed, not directly found. No tablet bears it. No scribe copied it. And yet, the evidence for it can become stronger than evidence for many things that were actually written down once and then misunderstood. Because if one family word can be recovered this way, how much of the lost language can be brought back? And the answer is more than most people first imagine. A lost tongue is not rebuilt from one beautiful example, or even 10. It comes back slowly, through repetition, the same sound leaning into another sound, the same shape appearing under different spellings, the same family resemblance showing up in word after word until the pattern stops feeling fragile and starts feeling stubborn. That is why the old comparison between mother, mater, matar, and meter matters so much. Not because it is charming, though it is, but because it belongs to a larger web. Let's gather the thread before we pull it tighter. Sir William Jones had opened the door in 1786. The family word gave us one clear glimpse through it. Now the real labor begins. Linguists line up cognate forms across daughter languages and ask a hard question. If these forms all came from an earlier source, what must that earlier source have looked like? What form best explains the descendants we actually have, not what would sound nice or feel ancient? That is a very different kind of imagination. In the comparative method, the scholar is not inventing freely. He is constrained at every step by the evidence that survives in later speech. If one sound in one branch regularly answers to another sound elsewhere, that matters. If a pattern fails when tested across more words, it is discarded. The reconstructed root is not written as a fact carved in stone. It wears that little star in front, star meh tu ter, almost like a warning label. This form is inferred. This form is accountable. This form must earn its place. And there is something quietly moving about that. You are listening to people in the present use living languages as tools to recover a human voice from deep prehistory. Not by magic, but by discipline. Bit by bit, the lost system begins to take shape. Sounds, forms, relationships, even the ghost of grammar behind the words. But that is also where the next difficulty appears. Because words alone can seduce us. They can glow too brightly. And if this vanished mother tongue is going to become more than a clever pattern on paper, the scholars have to show that they are recovering not just a list of old terms, but a whole language. And that is the next threshold in the dark. So far, we have a handful of powerful clues. Sir William Jones in 1786, the family likeness between Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and the small shock of that ancestral word for mother. But now we have to move from the obvious to the stubborn. Because a lost tongue is not proven by its most beautiful words. It is proven by the plain, repetitive, easy-to-miss pieces that hold speech together every day. This is the part people rarely imagine when they first hear about it. The real evidence is often not grand at all. It lives in endings, in recurring sounds, in tiny patterns that show up again and again across daughter languages. A scholar at a desk is not chasing romance now. He is checking whether the same correspondences keep holding when the words are less poetic, less famous, less likely to flatter the theory. If the pattern survives that test, then the old source begins to feel less like a ghost story and more like a structure. That is why the comparative method changed everything. It forced restraint. It asked linguists to be boring in the most disciplined way possible. A single striking cognate could tempt anyone. A whole web of regular correspondences? That is different. That begins to suggest sound systems, habits of formation, the shape of an older grammar. Not the full living voice, not yet, but the frame that once carried it. And still, there is a profound honesty built into the whole enterprise. Every reconstructed root keeps its little asterisk because the scholars know what they do not have. No one can open a chest and produce a page of this language. No one can point to a surviving inscription and say, there, that is what they wrote. The mother tongue remains unwritten, unrecovered in any direct sense. All of it must be inferred from what came later. That absence matters more than it may seem, because once you accept that no one ever wrote Proto-Indo-European down, the mystery changes. It is about more than how linguists compare words. It becomes a deeper question. If the language itself left no document, then how can anyone say when it was spoken, or where? And that question changes the scale of everything. Up to this point, the lost tongue has lived on the desk, in careful comparisons, in repeating sounds, in the asterisk before a form like asterisk me tu ter. But the moment you ask when it was spoken, the air in the room feels different. The paper is still there. The ink is still there. Yet now the scholars are no longer working only with words. They are staring into prehistory. Let's gather the thread before we go farther. The source itself was never written down. That matters. There is no direct record to date, no inscription to hold in your hand and say, this is from here, this is from then. So the time of Proto-Indo-European, the reconstructed mother tongue, has to be inferred the same way its forms are inferred, indirectly, cautiously, from what came after it. What emerges is not a precise birthday, but a window. Linguists place it roughly between 4,500 BCE and 2,500 BCE. That is a broad span, and it has to be broad because reconstruction does not give you a calendar page. It gives you relationships. It gives you layers. It tells you that this language must stand behind its daughters, and before the branches had drifted too far apart to still belong to one living speech community. You can feel the humility in that estimate. No neat answer, no boast, a range. And still, even that range is astonishing. You are suddenly dealing with a human voice from a world before its own writing, before any surviving sentence from it, before any speaker could have imagined that strangers thousands of years later would try to piece their language back together from fragments scattered across half a continent. The thing becomes larger, quieter, and stranger all at once. It is more than a puzzle of words. It is a vanished speaking world with no direct witness. But time is only half the problem, because once scholars had a rough age for it, another question pressed in from the dark, and it was even harder to answer. If this mother tongue really existed in that distant window, where, exactly, did human mouths once shape it? And that is where the search leaves the page and begins to feel almost geographical. A language does not float in empty space. If people spoke it, then they stood somewhere. They raised children somewhere. They argued, traded, buried their dead, called to one another across firelight or wind or open ground somewhere. So once linguists had that broad window, roughly 4,500 BCE to 2,500 BCE, the next question pressed in with quiet force. What kind of world could have held this speech before it split into daughters? Let's gather the path so far. Sir William Jones, in 1786, recognized the kinship. The family word for mother pointed backward toward an older form. The comparative method showed that regular sound correspondences could recover more than a few pleasing similarities. And yet none of that, by itself, gives a map. It gives relationships, not coordinates. So scholars had to reason indirectly again. If an older tongue stands behind Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and the others that would descend from it, then somewhere there must have been a community before the Great Dispersal. Not a single speaker, not a lone poet, but a real population large enough to pass on habits of sound and grammar across generations. That is the strange thing about this mystery. The language itself is invisible, but its consequences are vast. You can't touch the source, but you can see what happened after it broke apart. And so the question of place matters so much. Once you ask where it lived, you are no longer dealing only with sounds and roots. You are asking what sort of movement later carried it outward. Was it spread slowly, quietly, by generations of contact? Was it tied to a way of life that made expansion easier? Did its speakers possess some advantage of mobility that allowed their speech to travel far beyond its first home? Those questions sit there in the dark for a while, and they do not answer easily. Because if the mother tongue was spoken before writing preserved it, then its homeland cannot be found in a library. It has to be approached through clues, the same way the language itself was approached. And one particular clue, when scholars began to follow it, pointed not toward a city at all, but toward people in motion. And that hint of movement leads slowly to open grassland. The scholars did not leap from a few related words straight to a map with a neat circle drawn on it. They moved the way they had moved from the start, carefully, reluctantly, following consequences rather than wishes. If this old speech once belonged to a real community, and if that community later sent daughter languages outward across enormous distances, then its home had to make that spread possible. So let's gather the trail again. First came the recognition in 1786, then the family resemblances, then the regular sound correspondences, which let linguists move back toward older forms, then the broad dating window, between 4500 BCE and 2500 BCE. Now the question becomes physical. What kind of place fits a language that did not stay put? This is where the idea of the steppe homeland enters the story. Picture long reaches of grass, wind moving low over the ground. No city walls, no library shelves, no archive waiting to preserve a sentence. A place where distance matters, where mobility matters even more, and where a way of life can carry speech farther than stone monuments ever could. The appeal of that setting is not romantic decoration, it is explanatory force. A language that later spreads widely is easier to imagine in the mouths of people already used to movement. And in the model that gains the most weight, those people were the Yamnaya. About 3000 BCE, Yamnaya steppe herders spread this tongue with horses and wagons. That detail matters because it gives the mystery an engine, a homeland with a mechanism. Speakers who could move, settle, mix, and carry their habits of sound into new regions. Suddenly, the language is not a still object behind glass. It is traveling. But here too, caution matters. A convincing homeland is not the same thing as proof. A migration story can sound elegant and still be wrong. For a long time, this picture remained powerful, yet vulnerable. It needed something harsher than theory, something that did not live in grammar tables or reconstructed roots. It needed bodies. It needed evidence from the dead. And that harder kind of evidence arrived from a place no 19th century linguist could have reached. Let's gather the trail before it branches again. The old argument began with Sir William Jones in 1786, deepened through cognates and regular sound patterns, and then pointed toward a moving population rather than a settled literary culture. By the time the Yamnaya entered the picture, steppe herders spreading with horses and wagons around 3000 BCE, The theory had real force, but it still lived, in a sense, inside language. Powerful, yes. Final, not quite. Then the dead began to speak in a different way, with ancestry. Ancient DNA studies changed the temperature of the whole discussion because they could test something linguists had long suspected: whether there really had been a major movement of people from the steppe into later populations. And the answer, when it came, was not soft or ambiguous. The migration was there. Not as a legend, not as a poetic image of riders under a wide sky, but as a biological signal carried in human remains and echoed in descendants. That matters enormously for this mystery, because the argument for this mother tongue had never been only that related languages exist. It was that those languages likely spread outward from a real prehistoric community. The ancient DNA evidence did not recover a single spoken sentence. It did not place a lost voice back into the air. But it did something almost as dramatic. It confirmed that the broad movement long associated with the steppe homeland was real. People had moved, substantially, far enough and powerfully enough to change the human landscape. You can feel the scale of that revelation if you slow down for a moment. A suspicion born in 1786 from the comparison of Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin suddenly finds support from bodies buried thousands of years earlier. Language and ancestry, two very different archives, begin to point in the same direction. And yet, this is where the mystery becomes more delicate, not less. Because genes can confirm migration. They cannot, by themselves, tell you which words were spoken over campfires, beside wagons, or into the ears of children. So how tightly can a people's movement be tied to a language's spread? And the honest answer is, not as tightly as people sometimes want. This is one of those moments when the mystery becomes more respectable precisely because it becomes less neat. Ancient DNA studies can show that people moved. They can show that the movement associated with the steppe was real and large enough to matter. But a genome does not preserve a sentence. Bone can tell you ancestry. It cannot tell you whether a mother soothed her child in one tongue or another, or whether a village changed its speech slowly across 2 or 3 generations. So let's gather the line carefully. We have the old linguistic case, beginning with Sir William Jones in 1786. We have cognates, recurring sound patterns, and reconstructed forms. We have the steppe model, with Yamnaya herders spreading outward around 3000 BCE. And now we have ancient DNA confirming that such a migration was not imagined. But language and ancestry are not identical things. They overlap, and they also slip past each other. That matters because it keeps us from turning a deep human story into a diagram that is too clean to be true. Sometimes people adopt the speech of newcomers without much population change. Sometimes populations mix, yet older speech habits hold on for a time. Sometimes prestige, trade, marriage, and the simple wish to belong can shift language faster than bloodlines shift. The spread of this mother tongue was almost certainly not one single act repeated everywhere in the same way. It was a long process of movement and adoption, of households and children and neighbors, of one way of speaking becoming another. And that, strangely, makes the story feel more human. The lost source never conquered the world as an abstract system. It traveled through mouths, through lullabies, bargains, commands, jokes, kinship terms, names for familiar things, through the ordinary texture of life. So the old family word still matters so much. A cognate is not just a linguistic clue. It is evidence that some deeply repeated part of human life endured as the branches spread apart. But once you admit that language spread in messy human ways, a new question appears. If scholars cannot rely on genes alone, and cannot rely on writing because there is none, then what else can they use to glimpse the world these speakers lived in before the branches broke away? And that is where the language begins to reveal its world. Let's gather the pieces before we turn them over. We have the recognition in 1786. We have the family word for mother, pointing back through its descendants. We have the comparative method, which lets scholars move from repeated patterns toward older forms. We have the steppe migration around 3000 BCE, supported by ancient DNA. But if genes cannot speak, and no text survives, then the next clues have to come from inside the reconstructed language itself, from ordinary words. This is one of the most intimate parts of the whole mystery. A language carries the shape of daily life. If enough related words can be rebuilt, they begin to suggest the world their speakers moved through, more like the outline left behind when an object is lifted from dust. You can start to sense what mattered enough to be named again and again. And that changes the feeling of the story. The old source stops being only a system of sounds. It becomes a lived environment. Families, movement, familiar tools, the nearest animals, the habits of work and travel. That is why a reconstructed root matters beyond pure linguistics. It is not just a form on paper with a star in front of it. It is a surviving trace of repeated human use. Someone said those words to another person. Many people did, over generations. This is also where caution becomes almost moral. Scholars have to resist the temptation to overpaint the scene. A few recovered words do not give you a full society. They do not tell you everything about belief, politics, emotion, or ritual. But they can suggest broad textures. They can hint at whether the speakers belong to a world of mobility rather than urban record-keeping, a world where movement itself helped carry speech outward. And once you accept that, the Yamnaya model starts to feel less like a bold guess and more like a fit between different kinds of evidence. Still, a hint is not a portrait. Because if reconstructed vocabulary can sketch the edges of a vanished world, then the next question becomes sharper than ever. How much of that world can be recovered before the scholars begin seeing more than the language can truly bear? And that is the danger at the center of this whole search. A reconstructed language can be so compelling, so strangely vivid, that people start to treat it as if it were already standing in front of them in full daylight. But it is not. It is still recovered from descendants, still filtered through method, still bounded by what later languages happened to preserve. So the scholars who work on it have to move with a kind of discipline that is almost moral. Every step forward has to be earned. Let's gather what we can say without pretending to say too much. The chain begins with Sir William Jones in 1786. It gains force through repeated cognates and regular sound correspondences. It reaches toward reconstructed forms like matar. It settles, cautiously, into a broad time window between 4500 BCE and 2500 BCE. Then the picture of movement grows stronger with the Yamnaya spread around 3000 BCE, and ancient DNA confirms that the migration itself was real. All of that is strong, but none of it gives a complete portrait of the speaker's inner world. So the language offers outlines, not total access. That distinction matters because listeners, and sometimes scholars too, want more. They want to know what these people believed, how they saw the sky, what they feared, what they loved, how they ordered family life, what a child heard first, what a traveler called out across open ground. Some of that may be hinted at in the old forms, but hint is the right word. The evidence can support broad textures more confidently than intimate details. And yet, those textures are not trivial. If a language can be traced through repeated patterns, and if its spread aligns with large prehistoric movement, then even its limits become meaningful. The fact that it cannot tell us everything is not a weakness in the story, it is part of the story. We are dealing with a vanished speaking world that left no writing of its own. Every recovered piece is precious, partly because it is incomplete. That incompleteness creates a very strange feeling. The closer scholars get to the old source, the more clearly they can see its structure, and the more sharply they feel the silence around it. Which leads to the next question. If the grammar and the movement can be inferred, what about the family that came after it? And that question opens into one of the most beautiful parts of the mystery. If there really was a single ancestral speech behind all these later forms, then it did not vanish without consequence. It broke apart. It traveled. It changed in different mouths, under different skies, across different generations. What began as one shared source became a family. Let's gather the line again, because the shape matters. In 1786, Sir William Jones recognized that Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin pointed back toward a common origin. The comparison of words like mother, mater, matar, and meter gave that intuition a human texture. The comparative method made it possible to move from scattered likenesses to a disciplined reconstruction. Then came the wider frame, a language spoken roughly between 4500 BCE and 2500 BCE, spread with steppe movement around 3000 BCE, later supported by ancient DNA evidence of real migration. Now we can finally look at the consequence of all that movement. The descendants are the proof that the source did not simply disappear. They are what remains of it. Every later branch preserves something, and every branch also lost something. That is the strange tenderness of this story. No daughter language kept the whole inheritance intact. Each carried away only part of the old house, a sound here, an ending there, a pattern of kinship words, a way of shaping a verb, a habit of building meaning that once belonged to a larger living system. You can almost picture it, one family leaving a common home and taking different objects into different futures. Not because anyone meant to divide it neatly, but because that is what time does. Speech drifts, children shorten things, neighbors influence one another, distances grow, centuries pass. And yet the old resemblance remains, stubbornly, inside the changed forms. So a single cognate can feel so moving. It is not only evidence, it is survival. But this is where the mystery becomes even more delicate. Because if every later language preserved only a fragment, then the lost source can never be recovered from one descendant alone. It has to be assembled from overlap. And that means the next question is unavoidable. What would the old tongue have sounded like if no living branch kept its whole voice? And that is where the story turns from family tree to voice. We know by now that no single descendant kept the whole inheritance. Sanskrit preserves some things with striking clarity. Greek keeps others. Latin carries its own share. Later branches drift farther, each one changing the old material in its own way. So, if you want to get close to the lost source, you cannot listen to one child of the family and call that enough. You have to place them side by side and let their overlaps speak. Let's gather the method one more time, because here it becomes almost physical. A linguist compares forms across daughter languages, tracks the regular sound correspondences, and asks what earlier pattern would best account for all of them at once. That is how a reconstructed root emerges. Not because one language remembered it perfectly, but because several remembered different parts of it. One preserved the beginning more clearly, another kept the ending, a third held on to a sound change that helps explain the rest. And suddenly, the old tongue feels less like a void, more like a structure under pressure. This is one of the strangest pleasures in the whole field. You are hearing an approximation built from surviving traces, not a recording, the way a face can be sketched from several relatives who resemble the same ancestor in different ways. The jaw from one branch, the eyes from another, the cadence perhaps only in outline. Enough to recognize kinship, not enough to mistake the sketch for the living person. That distinction matters deeply. Scholars can infer a sound system. They can get close to forms, patterns, and relationships. But certainty has edges. The old speech was never written down. It passed through human mouths and vanished into time before anyone fixed it in ink. So every recovered sound comes with both confidence and restraint. This likely belonged there. That probably shifted later. This feature survives in one branch more cleanly than in another. And if that feels delicate, it should. Because once you begin asking what it might have sounded like, a new hunger appears almost at once. You start wanting to know more than the sounds, more than the roots. What it felt like to think inside that language at all. And that is a more difficult question than it first sounds. To ask what it felt like to think inside this lost tongue is to step right up to the edge of what reconstruction can give us. Sound patterns, shared roots, recurring endings, those are strong. They can be tested, they can be compared. But the inner texture of thought is harder. It does not sit still on the page. It has to be approached through the habits a language leaves behind. Let's gather the path again before we move forward. We know the old source stood behind later branches. We know no single daughter preserved it whole. We know the comparative method lets scholars recover forms by overlap, by repeated correspondences, by traces that survive in several places at once. We also know the people who spread it were not fixed in one written culture, but part of a moving prehistoric world, tied in the strongest model to steppe expansion around 3000 BCE. So what can the language itself still tell us? At the very least, it tells us that thought was organized through recurring structures that later branches still carry in altered form. Family terms matter here. So do patterns that show how speakers linked people to actions, actions to objects, and belonging to grammar. You begin to see that this was a system for arranging experience, not just a loose heap of words, for making relations visible, for telling who did what, to whom, and in what kind of bond. That may sound technical, but it is intimate. Every language trains attention a little differently. Not by imprisoning thought, that would be too simple, but by making some distinctions habitual, easy, repeated, felt in the mouth long before they are analyzed. And if enough of those habits can be traced backward, then the old tongue begins to feel less like a silent fossil and more like a mental rhythm carried forward in fragments. Still, this is where humility matters most. Because the farther we go from forms we can test, the more careful we have to become. A reconstructed system can suggest how meaning was built. It cannot hand us the full emotional weather of its speakers. It can bring us near the threshold, but not fully inside. And once you reach that threshold, another longing appears almost immediately. Not only what they thought, but what they said first, most often, and closest to home. And that is often where the whole mystery becomes unexpectedly tender. The oldest recoverable pieces are the close words, not grand speeches, royal commands, or the language of monuments. The house words, the ones spoken near a child's face, across a meal, beside a sleeping place, on a path walked 1,000 times. When a cognate survives in several branches, especially in something as intimate as kinship, you are not only seeing linguistic evidence, You are seeing repetition in human life. Let's gather the thread before we follow it deeper. The old source was reconstructed because later languages kept overlapping traces of it. No single branch preserved the whole. The family spread, changed, and carried fragments away. Some of those fragments point to movement and social structure. Some point to daily life. And the closer the word is to home, the more startling that continuity feels. Because these are not decorative leftovers. If a form connected to mother can survive across such distance and time, then it tells you something about how stubborn certain parts of speech are. The nearest relationships resist erasure. They change, yes, but slowly, with a kind of emotional inertia. They are used too often, too early, too deeply in ordinary life to vanish all at once. That is why they matter so much to reconstruction. They are spoken before formal learning, before writing, before history notices them. And once you hear that, the lost tongue shifts again. It is no longer only a prehistoric system spread by movement around 3000 BCE. It becomes something carried in habit, in the sounds people reached for first, without reflection. A mother calling, a child repeating, a household using the same forms until they wear smooth in the mouth. Over centuries, those forms drift apart, but not beyond recognition. That is the eerie part. Time pulls them away from one another, yet some inner likeness remains. Still, even these intimate survivals can tempt us to overreach. A handful of close words cannot give us the entire emotional life of those speakers. They can bring us near the threshold of the home, but not all the way inside. And once you accept that limit, another question steps forward from the dark. Not what single word survived, but how the whole pattern of survival was distributed across the later branches. And that distribution is where the reconstruction becomes almost uncanny. A single surviving word can move you, yes, but a whole pattern scattered across later branches does something deeper. It shows that it left a broken inheritance. Each descendant carried away certain pieces and dropped others, and only when those pieces are laid side by side does the older shape begin to return. Let's gather the picture carefully. The language behind Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and their distant relatives was never written down. It had to be recovered through repeated correspondences, through cognates, through forms that preserved just enough of the past to be compared. The branches spread outward, changed under new pressures, and kept only fragments. That means loss is not an accident in this story. Loss is the condition that makes reconstruction necessary. And yet, loss is also what makes the surviving pieces so valuable. One branch may preserve an old sound more faithfully. Another may blur that sound but keep a grammatical ending intact. A third may simplify the ending and still preserve the shape of a root. The old system survives only like light caught in broken glass, not gone, not complete, but still able to show its original direction if you are patient enough to turn the pieces in your hand. That is why the work can feel both rigorous and strangely emotional at the same time. The scholar is doing something exacting, even severe, testing patterns, rejecting false parallels, holding back from wishful thinking. But underneath that discipline is a quiet human drama. The realization that no later language is sufficient by itself. The inheritance only becomes visible through comparison, through relationship, through the fact that separated descendants still answer one another across time. There is something almost tender in that. Not because the science is soft, it is not, but because the truth it reveals is relational. The old tongue survives not in one proud monument, but in overlap. And once you see that, another question begins to press in. If the ancestral speech can only be recovered from fragments distributed across later languages, then every act of reconstruction is also an act of listening for what each branch forgot, and what each branch, against all odds, still remembers. And that act of listening for memory inside loss leads to a very human question. What exactly has each branch remembered? In a practical one, if the old source survives only in fragments, then every daughter language becomes a witness with gaps in its testimony. One remembers a sound clearly, but lets a grammatical pattern erode. Another keeps the pattern while reshaping the sound. Another preserves a familiar word in daily speech, but hides its ancestry under centuries of change. Let's gather the ground under our feet. Sir William Jones opened the first door in 1786. The kinship of forms like mother, mater, matar, and meter showed that the door led somewhere real. The comparative method gave scholars a way to test those relations rather than merely admire them. Later, the broader frame of time and movement, 4,500 BCE to 2,500 BCE. Then, Yamnaya expansion around 3000 BCE, later supported by ancient DNA, gave the lost tongue a place in human history. Now the question narrows again, back down to the branches themselves. And this is where reconstruction becomes almost like patient cross-examination. No branch gets to speak alone. That is the rule. A later language may look conservative in one area and innovative in another. It may seem to preserve something ancient, then suddenly mislead you with a later development that only feels old because it is familiar. So scholars compare again, and compare against a wider field. They ask not which daughter is oldest in some grand romantic sense, but which feature, in this particular case, is likely closer to the ancestral pattern. That restraint matters. Without it, the whole enterprise would slide into preference and myth. Instead, the lost mother tongue emerges from disagreement held in balance. Not because every descendant says the same thing, but because their differences can still be measured against one another. That is the astonishing part. Change did not erase relationship. It made relationship traceable. And once you realize that, another threshold appears. Because if the branches can be weighed this way, if memory survives in uneven, testable fragments, then you can begin asking a question that feels almost forbidden at first. Could scholars ever dare to speak the old forms aloud? And that is where the whole enterprise seems to hover between science and seance. Except it is neither mystical nor careless. To speak an old, reconstructed form aloud is a daring thing. Not because scholars believe they have captured the voice exactly, but because they know they have not. The sound system can be inferred. Patterns can be tested. A form can be justified. And yet, the moment breath passes through a modern mouth, something changes. The old source stops being only a chart of correspondences and becomes, for an instant, a lived possibility. Let's gather the boundary clearly. This language was never written down. It survives only through descendants, through recurring structures, through cognates, through a method strict enough to recover probable forms without pretending to recover certainty. That matters here more than ever. When someone voices a reconstructed root, they are not opening a recording from prehistory. They are offering the best disciplined approximation the evidence allows. There is humility in that little asterisk before a form. It says, this is inferred. It also says, this is not fantasy. And still, when such a form is spoken, something almost physical happens in the imagination. You hear not the ancient world itself, but the shape of a bridge toward it, a possible vowel, a likely stress, a consonant placed where several daughter languages suggest it once belonged. The result can feel haunting, though not because it is magical, because it is close enough to stir recognition and distant enough to remind you of everything missing. That mixture of nearness and absence is one of the deepest emotional currents in this story. You are listening to a human attempt to give air, however imperfectly, to a system that helped generate vast later families of speech. A tongue spoken roughly between 4500 BCE and 2500 BCE, carried outward with prehistoric movement, reconstructed from fragments that survived by accident and use. Not restored whole, but not lost beyond reach either. And once a language can be spoken, even cautiously, another question rises almost at once. If scholars can approach its sounds, what else might be carried in those sounds besides vocabulary and grammar? What older habits of meaning might still be alive inside the languages we speak now? And that possibility is where the story turns inward. Inward in a stricter sense. If old habits of sound and structure can survive across thousands of years, then some of the ways later speakers organize meaning may also carry faint pressure from that buried source. Not whole ideas, not ancient beliefs preserved intact like insects in amber, but tendencies, pathways, familiar grooves in the making of meaning. Let's gather the thread before we pull it tight. We began with Sir William Jones in 1786 and his recognition that Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin belonged to one family. We followed the evidence through cognates, through the comparative method, through reconstructed forms, through the broad dating of 4500 BCE to 2500 BCE, and through the steppe expansion around 3000 BCE, later supported by ancient DNA evidence. Then the story narrowed again into fragments preserved by different daughter languages, and finally to the daring act of sounding those fragments aloud. Now the question becomes more intimate than sound. A language does not only name things, it teaches its speakers, gently and constantly, how to mark relations, how to track action, how to distinguish near from far, known from unknown, belonging from not belonging. Later branches do this in their own ways, of course. They have changed too much to be treated as frozen relics. But if several of them preserve deep structural habits from the older source, then some part of that prehistoric system is still alive whenever those habits are used. That is a strange thought to sit with for a moment. It means the lost tongue did not vanish when its speakers vanished as a unified community. It dissolved into continuities, into recurring patterns too ordinary to feel ancient, into grammar people use without thinking, into inherited ways of linking person, action, and world, never in pure form, but not absent either. And once you feel that, the distance of prehistory changes. The mother tongue is no longer only behind us, sealed off in a vanished age of migration and unwritten speech. It is also dispersed through the present, hidden in forms so familiar that most speakers never notice them at all. Which leads to the deepest turn yet. If that buried inheritance still shapes ordinary language now, then this is no longer just a story about them. It is beginning to become a story about you. And that is the moment when the mystery stops being safely distant. Up to now, you could keep it in the deep past if you wanted. You could place it among steppe migrations, unwritten speech, reconstructed forms, and the long shadow of 1786, when Sir William Jones first noticed the family resemblance. You could admire the craft of the comparative method, the care with which scholars move from cognates to older patterns, and the way ancient DNA evidence later gave real historical weight to the idea of movement around 3000 BCE. All of that still feels, in some sense, far away. But once you suspect that old structures survive inside ordinary modern speech, distance begins to fail. Let's gather the path one more time, slowly. The law source was spoken roughly between 4500 BCE and 2500 BCE. It left no writing of its own. It had to be inferred from descendants. Those descendants preserved fragments, unevenly, imperfectly, but enough. A kinship word here, a sound pattern there, a grammatical habit repeated so often that it passed through centuries almost unnoticed. Changed, but not erased either. That is the strange part. Most people imagine ancestry through faces, bloodlines, heirlooms, maybe family names. But language carries ancestry too, and it carries it in a way that is both intimate and invisible. You do not need to study historical linguistics to participate in it. You already do. Every time you speak a form whose history runs deeper than you are touching an inheritance that survived migrations, separations, and the slow wear of time. Imperfectly, in no pure or simple way. The later branches changed too much for that. They became themselves. They built new worlds. Still, the buried source remains present in the pressure of old relationships, in the way forms answer one another across languages, and sometimes even in the shape of habits modern speakers never stop to question. That is why this story matters beyond scholarship. It is not only about recovering a prehistoric tongue. It is about realizing that the past does not stay where we put it. Sometimes it continues inside the most familiar things, unnoticed because they are too near, too ordinary, too fully woven into daily life. And once that realization settles in, a final question begins to take shape. If language can carry memory this deeply, what else are we carrying without knowing it? And that question brings us to the real emotional center of all this. What else are we carrying without knowing it? More than most of us ever stop to consider, the old source does not survive as a secret message hidden in plain sight. And modern speech is not some untouched relic. It survives the way deep inheritance usually survives, broken, altered, absorbed into later life so fully that it no longer feels ancient at all. Let's gather the path one more time, because here the pieces finally begin to press against one another. In 1786, Sir William Jones noticed that Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin pointed back toward one common source. The family likeness in words like mother, mater, matar, and meter made that insight feel immediate. The comparative method turned it into disciplined recovery. From there came the reconstructed forms, the unwritten time depth between 4500 BCE and 2500 BCE, the movement associated with Yamnaya around 3000 BCE, and the later ancient DNA evidence that confirmed large migration from the steppe. All of that is scholarship, but it is also something more intimate. Because what reconstruction gives back is not just information. It gives back continuity. It tells us that the past is not merely behind us in sealed layers, not as memory we consciously keep, but as habits of speech, as inherited structures, as old solutions to the problem of making meaning with other human beings. The mother tongue was not preserved whole. It dissolved into descendants. Yet, in dissolving, it also endured. That is why this story resists becoming a dry technical exercise. A lost language, never written down, spoken in prehistory, should, by all ordinary logic, be gone beyond recovery. And yet it is not fully. Enough remains for scholars to test, compare, and cautiously voice. Enough remains for modern speakers to discover that some of their most ordinary forms belong to a chain of human continuity vastly older than they imagined. And once that settles in, one final unease, or maybe one final wonder, begins to rise. If language can outlast its speakers in this way, then perhaps forgetting is never quite as complete as it feels. And maybe that is the quietest surprise of all, that recovery does not erase mystery, it deepens it. By now, the outline is firm enough to trust. Sir William Jones, in 1786, noticed that Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin were too closely related to be accidents. Later scholars followed those resemblances through cognates, through regular sound correspondences, through the comparative method, and back toward forms marked with that modest asterisk. The language itself was never written down, yet its descendants preserved enough to let the older system emerge. Then, the broader historical frame came into view. A speech community somewhere in the long span between 4500 BCE and 2500 BCE, and movement from the steppe around 3000 BCE later, reinforced by ancient DNA evidence. That is already remarkable. But it is not the end of the strangeness. Because once a thing is shown to be real, the mind immediately wants it to be complete. We want the final certainty, the exact sound, the exact homeland, the exact moment one branch became another. We want to stand at the border between lost and found and say, here, this is the whole truth. But this story refuses that comfort, not because the evidence is weak, but because human history itself is not built to satisfy that kind of hunger. The old source remains partly veiled. We can recover patterns, not a recording. We can trace spread, not every conversation. We can infer structures of meaning, not the full weather of a vanished mind. And yet, that incompleteness does not diminish the achievement. If anything, it makes it more moving. Scholars did not resurrect a fantasy. They recovered a real ancestral presence from fragments that should have dissolved beyond recognition. There is something profoundly human in that, the refusal to let disappearance have the last word. Once you see the story that way, the language becomes more than a subject in historical linguistics. It becomes an example of how memory survives in indirect forms. In traces, in recurrence, in relationships between later things that point back to something older, quieter, and foundational. Which leaves us with one last turn before the end. If this buried mother tongue can still be approached through what came after it, what does that say about the way all human identity is layered? Speech over speech, generation over generation, memory inside forgetting. And that layered quality may be the most honest way to think about human identity at all. Not as one clean origin or one pure inheritance preserved untouched from the past, but as accumulation, voice over voice, habit over habit, memory settling into newer memory, until the older layers are no longer visible unless someone knows how to listen for them. That is what this reconstructed mother tongue reveals so powerfully. Not only where later languages came from, but how deeply the past can remain present without announcing itself. Let's gather the arc one last time before the final turn. A scholar in 1786, Sir William Jones, notices a family resemblance between Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin. That resemblance leads to a method. The method leads to reconstructed forms. The forms point toward a real but unwritten language spoken somewhere between 4500 BCE and 2500 BCE. The spread of that language begins to align with Yamnaya movement around 3000 BCE, and ancient DNA evidence later confirms that large migration from the steppe truly happened. From there, the fragments preserved in daughter languages begin to yield structure, sound, and traces of a vanished speaking world. What emerges is something better than a myth of perfect recovery. It is the recognition that ancestry does not survive only in bodies or surnames or stories families deliberately pass down. It also survives in systems we inhabit without noticing, in grammar, in recurring forms, in the tiny repeated acts by which one human being makes meaning available to another. The old source is gone as a living community, yes, but its descendants still carry pressures set in motion long before any modern nation, long before most written history, long before the people now speaking those later languages had names we would recognize. And that changes the emotional scale of the whole subject. You are no longer looking at a technical puzzle sitting safely behind museum glass. You are looking at a deep structure of continuity that runs through ordinary life. The everyday sentence becomes older. The familiar word becomes stranger. The mouth becomes, in a small but real way, an archive. And once that thought settles fully, the final question almost asks itself: when you speak tomorrow, whose vanished world will still be moving quietly inside your own? And perhaps that is the final resolution. The lost tongue has not been fully recovered, but it has been brought back far enough to change the way silence itself feels. The mystery began with an absence. No inscription, no manuscript, no speaker we could hear. Then, piece by piece, the dark gave way. Sir William Jones, in 1786, noticing the kinship of Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin. The old family word for mother surviving in separated branches. The comparative method turning resemblance into evidence. The asterisk before a reconstructed form marking both caution and confidence. The broad span between 4500 BCE and 2500 BCE. The steppe movement around 3000 BCE. Ancient DNA evidence showing that people really did move in ways the language story had long implied. What seemed impossible at the beginning became, by the end, something quietly solid, something more honest than a perfect resurrection. The old source returned as pressure, in repeated sounds, in inherited structures, in branches that still answer one another after thousands of years apart. It survived the way frost survives after sunrise, a silver edge lingering on the grass where the light has not fully reached, instead of a sheet over the whole field. You kneel close enough, and there it is. That is what this story leaves us with. A mother tongue once carried by people on the move, never written down, broken into daughters, buried under time, and yet still recoverable because ordinary human speech kept passing small, faithful things from mouth to mouth. A household word, a grammatical habit, a sound change regular enough to be traced backward. The vanished world did not stay whole, but it did not vanish cleanly either. Now the room is quieter. The rain has thinned to a faint tapping at the glass. The page on the desk looks still again, just paper, just ink. And yet, it is no longer only that. Somewhere beneath the words "you already know," wheels are turning over dry ground. A parent is calling to a child, and a language with no surviving document is briefly warm again in human breath. The lamp burns lower. The window darkens. The old forms settle back into silence, not absence.